My father had been buried less than 2 hours when my stepmother drove me to a remote sugar-cane road. She shoved me into the mud, snatched my phone, and said this was where my father's mistake ended. She thought she erased her last obstacle, but I do not live on inheritance. I expose corporate fraud for a living. If your family ever underestimated you, keep listening, because I am about to tear down a sugar empire. My name is Mia Rogers. The damp chill of a street. Clare Parish. Morning seeped through the soles of my black leather pumps, chilling me to the bone. It had rained for 3 days straight in Louisiana, turning the historic graveyard into a miserable, sinking sponge. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and impending rot. A fitting atmosphere for the occasion. We were here to bury Howard Rogers, my father, and the undisputed king of the Rogers Cane and Confection Group. He was a titan of the sweet food industry, a man who built a fortune on refined sugar and ruthless business acumen. Now, he was just another body going into the waterlogged ground. Across the open grave, Evelyn Price Rogers, my dear stepmother, was delivering the performance of a lifetime. Clad in impeccable, custom-tailored mourning couture, she dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a monogrammed silk handkerchief. Beside her stood her son, Grant Price, his face arranged into a rigid mask of solemn duty. Together, they were the flawless picture of a tragic, dignified legacy, playing directly to the gallery of corporate executives, investment bankers, and local reporters who had swarmed the cemetery. They were the official family. I stood 30 feet away, standing under a solitary oak tree, entirely separated from the grieving party. I was the ghost at the feast, the firstborn daughter who did not fit the pristine corporate narrative Evelyn had spent the last 15 years carefully crafting. The service ended with the hollow thud of dirt hitting polished mahogany as the crowd began to murmur and disperse toward their idling town cars. Evelyn drifted away from the grave and moved directly toward me. Her entourage of sycophants and board members parted like the Red Sea to let her through. She reached out, her black-gloved hand resting lightly on my forearm. The gesture was purely for the benefit of the watching cameras and the whispering stakeholders. "Mia, darling," she cooed, her voice pitched perfectly loud enough for a nearby business journalist to hear every syllable. "It breaks my heart to see you so isolated today. Howard would have wanted us together at the very end. Let us drive you to the airport. It is the least we can do. One last show of family unity for his sake." I knew better than to accept. Getting into a confined space with Evelyn was always a calculated risk, but refusing her public olive branch would give her exactly the headline she wanted for the morning paper's bitter estranged daughter snub's grieving widow. I maintained a neutral expression, gave a single nod, and followed her toward the line of waiting vehicles. The ride in Evelyn's customized black sport utility vehicle was suffocating. The air conditioning hummed a low, steady drone, but the silence inside the cabin was thick enough to choke on. The air smelled cloyingly of her expensive floral perfume, masking the tension. I sat in the back leather seat with Grant, while Evelyn rode shotgun next to her private driver. Grant spent the first 20 minutes staring at his phone, an arrogant, self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips as his thumbs tapped aggressively across the screen. I watched the gray Louisiana highway slip by through the tinted windows, but my internal alarm triggered when the driver smoothly bypassed the major exit for the international airport. Instead, the heavy vehicle banked hard to the right, tires crunching onto a poorly paved parish access route. Within 10 minutes, the broken pavement gave way to deeply rutted, washed-out dirt. We were plunging headfirst into the heart of the commercial sugar cane fields, a vast green ocean of towering stalks that completely swallowed the horizon. I glanced down at my phone resting on my lap. 0 bars of service. We were miles off the main grid, surrounded by thousands of acres of private agricultural land. The vehicle jolted violently as the driver slammed on the brakes. Mud splattered aggressively across the side windows, obscuring the view. Before I could even brace myself or process the sudden stop, Evelyn unbuckled her seatbelt and twisted around in the front seat. The elegant facade of the grieving widow vanished in a heartbeat, replaced entirely by the cold, calculating predator I had always known lurked beneath the designer clothes. "Get out," she commanded. Her voice was flat, sharp, and utterly devoid of any fake Southern charm. I looked at her, then turned my head to look at Grant, who was already leaning heavily against his door, shoving it open into the dreary afternoon. The thick, humid air of the agricultural fields rushed into the pristine, climate-controlled cabin. "I said, get out, Mia," Evelyn repeated, her tone dropping an octave. I did not argue. I stepped out into the ankle-deep mud, my expensive heels sinking instantly into the cold, brown sludge, before I could turn back to demand an explanation. Grant reached into the rear cargo area, grabbed my small leather travel suitcase, and chucked it out into the weather. It landed with a pathetic, wet slap in a deep, muddy drainage ditch. Then, in a move so fast and practiced it completely caught me off guard, Evelyn leaned far over the center console and snatched my heavy leather purse right off my shoulder. The strap burned against my skin as she ripped it away. My identification, my credit cards, my cash, and my useless phone were all securely zipped inside. I stood there in the chilling, biting wind, balancing awkwardly in the mud, staring at the woman who had systematically dismantled my place in my own family. Evelyn signaled the driver, and her window rolled down just a crack, leaving her cold, triumphant eyes locked onto mine. "This is where your father's mistake ends," she spat. The venom in her words absolute and unfiltered. She was making it perfectly clear I was the mistake. I was the stain on the pristine Rogers legacy she was about to fully inherit and liquidate. Grant leaned his head toward the open gap in the window, his earlier smirk now a full-blown, malicious sneer. "Do not even bother trying to find a ride back to the city for the will reading on Monday morning, Mia," he taunted, his voice echoing slightly in the vast emptiness of the fields. "Save yourself the embarrassment. There is absolutely nothing left for you. The Rogers Empire is ours now. Enjoy the long walk." The tinted window rolled up silently, sealing them back in their luxurious sanctuary. The heavy, all-terrain tires spun aggressively, kicking up a furious, high shower of thick brown sludge that splattered heavily across my black morning coat and bare legs. The vehicle sped off down the desolate access road, the rear lights disappearing quickly around a bend of tall cane. The roar of the powerful engine faded into the distance, leaving me completely surrounded by the endless whispering stalks of sugarcane and the howling wind. It was a picture-perfect cinematic scene of total, crushing defeat. A discarded daughter, stripped of her identity and resources, abandoned in the unforgiving wilderness to freeze or beg. I slowly looked down at the heavy mud ruining my expensive clothes. I looked at the deep, jagged tire tracks rapidly filling with dirty rainwater, and then, standing entirely alone in the middle of nowhere. I did not cry. I did not scream out in rage. I did not run desperately after the fading taillights begging them to come back. Instead, I let out a long, slow breath into the cold air and smiled. It was a cold, sharp, dangerous smile. Evelyn and Grant thought this was a brilliant execution. A final, humiliating checkmate on a dirt road. They genuinely believed they had just erased their biggest problem with a theatrical display of cruelty, but they were arrogant fools. This was not the first time they had tried to wipe me off the board, but I promised myself it would absolutely be the last. They thought they were leaving a helpless heiress in the mud. They had absolutely no idea who they had just declared war on. The taillights were long gone, leaving behind a heavy silence broken only by the rustle of the cane stalks rubbing against each other in the damp wind. Evelyn thought stripping me of my leather tote meant stripping me of my power. She was playing a country club game. I played in the major leagues. I reached down to the hem of my heavy morning coat, running my fingers along the stiff, reinforced inner seam. I found the hidden zipper. It was a modification I insisted on after a particularly volatile audit at a mining facility in South America 3 years ago. From the waterproof lining, I extracted a slender, matte black satellite phone and a titanium corporate emergency card. At Northline Integrity Partners, I am a senior supply chain fraud investigator. My entire career is built on finding the lies that executives desperately try to bury. I tear apart fake quality control logs, trace phantom inventory through shell warehouses, and expose document manipulation that hides millions in stolen revenue. Dealing with hostile actors who want me stranded or silenced is standard operating procedure. Evelyn thought she was a mastermind. But to me, she was just another amateur trying to cover her tracks. I powered up the device. The screen glowed to life, quickly acquiring a signal from the orbit above the gloomy Louisiana clouds. I dialed the direct emergency line for my office in Houston. My assistant answered on the second ring. I kept my voice steady, dictating my exact global positioning coordinates. I told her to bypass the commercial airlines and contact Vanguard Security Solutions, a private contractor our firm retained for high-risk extractions. I needed a helicopter, and I needed it immediately. My original plan was to fly back to Texas and let the lawyers handle the formalities of my father's estate. That plan died the moment I hit the mud. I instructed my assistant to cancel the flight. I told her to have the pilot route the chopper directly to the downtown New Orleans heliport, nearest to the Voss and Harland Estate Council building. I was going to attend the reading of the will in person. I stood like a statue in the biting wind, the cold seeping into my skin, but a different kind of heat burned in my chest. I had 20 minutes until extraction. My mind drifted back 15 years. I was 19 years old when Evelyn executed her first purge. It was not a violent physical removal like today. It was a calculated, insidious smear campaign. She planted whispers in my father's ear and fed fabricated stories to his wealthy social circle, painting me as an erratic, destructive teenager who was a threat to the family image. She isolated me so thoroughly that leaving was my only option. My father, consumed by the expansion of his empire and manipulated by her tears, let me walk out the door. They expected me to fail. They expected me to become the tragic, lost daughter they claimed I was. Instead, I worked night shifts at diners and logistics warehouses, piecing together an education in forensic accounting and supply chain management. I learned to read corporate ledgers the way detectives read crime scenes. I learned how empires are built, and more importantly, how they fall when the foundational numbers are rotten. I had not been ignoring the Rogers Cane and Confection Group. From my desk in Texas, I had been quietly monitoring their public filings and industry whispers. The profit margins they were reporting over the past 18 months were impossible given the global sugar yield. Evelyn and Grant were artificially sweetening the books, desperately inflating the company valuation for an impending sale. I just needed the hard proof. The low, rhythmic thumping of rotor blades interrupted my thoughts. A dark, unmarked helicopter broke through the cloud cover, banking sharply as the pilot spotted my lone figure against the vast expanse of green. The downdraft hit the field with hurricane force, flattening the tall cane and whipping a fresh layer of muddy spray across my legs. A tactical operator slid the side door open, bracing himself against the wind, and extended a gloved hand down to me. Evelyn left me out here thinking the earth would swallow me up, that I would be paralyzed by the humiliation. She thought she was leaving behind a victim. She was wrong. As I grabbed the operator's hand and hoisted myself into the vibrating cabin, I felt a surge of cold adrenaline. I was not a discarded orphan. I was an investigator returning to an active crime scene. I strapped myself into the leather harness as the helicopter banked up and away from the parish, the green fields shrinking below us. The operator opened a storage compartment and offered me a stack of pristine white sanitary wipes, gesturing to my ruined clothes. I looked down at the thick, dark mud caked onto my expensive black coat, the dirty water soaking into my ruined shoes, the physical evidence of their cruelty. I looked back up at the operator and shook my head, pushing his hand away. I was going to keep every single ounce of dirt exactly where it was. When I walked into the polished mahogany boardroom at Voss and Harland, I wanted them to smell the swamp. I wanted them to look at me and realize, with absolute terror, that their dirty tactics had failed, and the mess they made was coming straight for them. The air inside the executive boardroom at Voss and Harland Estate Council was suffocating, thick with the scent of lemon furniture polish, bitter coffee, and the cloying floral perfume Evelyn always wore. I pushed open the massive oak double doors just as she reached the theatrical climax of her fabricated narrative. Her voice trembled with perfectly practiced sorrow as she addressed the assembled crowd of estate lawyers, minority shareholders, and skeptical banking representatives. She was currently spinning a desperate tale about my mental stability, claiming to the room that I had suffered a complete emotional breakdown at the cemetery and fled the grounds in a state of erratic panic. My abrupt entrance shattered her performance into 1,000 pieces. The thick layer of dark, wet mud coating my black morning coat and ruining my leather shoes left an unmistakable trail of filth on the pristine, cream-colored carpet. The entire boardroom went dead silent. Evelyn froze in her chair, her mouth hanging slightly open, the flawless mask of the grieving, protective stepmother slipping for one catastrophic, revealing second. Grant bristled in his high-backed leather seat, a flash of pure, unadulterated annoyance crossing his features. The senior bankers and minority partners immediately exchanged sharp, calculating glances. They were not fools. They were silently measuring the massive discrepancy between the hysterical, unhinged woman Evelyn had just described and the composed, albeit completely filthy, professional woman standing right in front of them. I walked slowly toward the center of the long mahogany table. I did not raise my voice in anger. I did not scream or demand an apology. I looked directly at the senior legal partner handling the estate and delivered a simple, devastating correction. I informed the room that I did not flee in a panic. I stated clearly, projecting my voice so every single person could hear, that at exactly 1:45 in the afternoon, Evelyn ordered her private driver to detour off the main highway. I explained that she drove me 3 miles deep into the isolated private cane fields where there was absolutely no cellular service. I told them she physically confiscated my mobile phone, my identification, and my cash before ordering me out of the vehicle into the mud. I laid out the precise timeline with the cold, sterile accuracy of a forensic corporate audit. The atmosphere in the room grew painfully uncomfortable. I could see the exact moment the banking representatives realized Evelyn was a massive liability who chose to lie under pressure rather than manage a crisis. The senior partner cleared his throat loudly, clearly eager to move past the explosive revelation, and broke the heavy wax seal on my father's final testament. The distribution of the empire was exactly as my father and I had always anticipated. Evelyn was granted total executive control over 75% of the voting shares in the Rogers Cane and Confection Group, effectively giving her the entire kingdom. Grant inherited the primary residential estate, all the lucrative vacation properties spread across the coast, and the entire luxury vehicle collection. When the lawyer finally reached my name at the very bottom of the document, the inheritance was predictably, almost comically, insulting. I was bequeathed the sum of exactly $500 and the contents of a specific safety deposit box located at a private banking branch in the French Quarter. Grant leaned far back in his chair and let out a loud, echoing laugh that bounced off the wood-paneled walls. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his custom-tailored suit, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and carelessly tossed it across the polished table. It fluttered lightly in the air before landing on the carpet right near my mud-soaked shoes. He told me that between the pathetic estate payout and his own generous personal donation, I finally had enough taxi money to crawl back to Texas and take my cheap little souvenirs with me. He wanted a reaction. He desperately wanted to humiliate me in front of the board and assert his new dominance. Before I could even form a response, a woman stood up abruptly from the far corner of the room. I recognized her immediately from the corporate regulatory filings I had memorized. Dana Mercer, the Chief Compliance and Quality Officer for the company. She wore a sharp charcoal gray suit and an expression of absolute, unfiltered disgust. She looked at me with open disdain, her posture rigid with visible irritation. She announced loudly to the room that she did not have the time or the patience for this pathetic family soap opera and that she had actual multi-million-dollar production lines to run. Dana gathered her thick leather folders with aggressive, jerky movements and marched purposefully toward the exit. As she passed me, she did not slow her pace at all. She intentionally bumped her shoulder hard against mine, to the rest of the board members and lawyers watching. It looked like a final, petty display of corporate hostility toward the outcast daughter, but in that split second of physical contact, I felt a small, tightly folded piece of heavy paper slide smoothly from her fingers into the palm of my hand. My fingers closed around it instantly, hiding it from view. I did not acknowledge Dana as she stormed out of the heavy double doors. I looked back at Grant, whose smug, arrogant smile was still plastered across his face. I did not offer him a single word of argument or defense. I simply turned around to leave. As I took my very first step, I planted the heavy heel of my mud-caked shoe directly onto the center of the $100 bill he had thrown on the floor. I ground the swamp mud deep into the paper currency, leaving a permanent, filthy stain on his little display of financial power, and walked out of the room without ever looking back. The elevator ride down to the main lobby was completely empty and dead silent. As the stainless steel doors closed, sealing me in, I uncurled my fingers and carefully flattened the small piece of paper. It was not a message of sympathy or a random corporate note. Written in sharp, hurried block letters was a 4-digit number, 9247, a safety deposit box personal identification number. Right below those numbers were 2 specific phrases that made the blood run cold in my veins. Escrow intellectual property file, sugar hedges. The breath caught sharply in my throat. This was not about old family photographs or sentimental pieces of jewelry my father wanted me to have. Escrow intellectual property meant my father had quietly and legally segregated the core chemical formulas and the elite brand rights away from the physical, tangible company assets, and the mention of sugar hedges meant someone in that boardroom was secretly, and likely illegally, gambling with the company's future on the volatile commodities market. My father had not left me a token of affection to remember him by. He had left me a fully loaded weapon, and Dana Mercer, the woman who just pretended to despise me, had just handed me the ammunition to fire it. The private viewing room deep within the subterranean vault of the French Quarter Bank smelled of ozone and old paper. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind me, sealing me inside a sterile, windowless space illuminated by a single fluorescent overhead light. I placed the long metal security box onto the scuffed mahogany table. The 4-digit code Dana had passed to me unlocked the latch with a heavy, satisfying metallic clunk. I lifted the lid, half expecting a final trick, but found exactly what my father intended. There were no velvet pouches of family diamonds. There were no stacks of sequential $100 bills. Instead, the box contained 3 thick manila folders, a small encrypted digital drive, and a thick envelope sealed with red wax bearing my name in his unmistakable, sloping handwriting. I sat down and approached the contents the exact same way I approached a hostile corporate audit. I was reading a crime scene. I opened the first folder. It was a dense, highly complex intellectual property escrow agreement. This document legally severed the core. Proprietary chemical formulas of the flagship sweetener and the elite brand trademarks from the physical manufacturing assets of the Rogers Cane and Confection Group. It was a masterclass in corporate defense. The second folder made my pulse quicken. It contained a stack of heavily redacted internal quality control reports from our 2 largest processing facilities. I traced my finger over the printed data columns, reading the story hidden within the numbers. It was a systematic catalog of failure and cover-ups. Entire production runs had failed basic safety compliance tests. Instead of destroying the defective batches, someone had authorized the substitution of substandard raw materials, systematically mislabeled the non-compliant product, and shipped it out to premium distributors. It was a massive, multi-million-dollar supply chain fraud. The third folder held the key to the entire trap. It contained the master lending agreements with the primary investment banks that funded the corporate operations. I scanned the pages until I found the exact clauses I was looking for. There were specific, catastrophic trigger events embedded in the covenants. If the company was caught falsifying financial reports, or if they were found guilty of severe safety and compliance violations, the banks had the immediate right to call in the debt. I pushed the folders aside and plugged the small encrypted drive into my secure tablet. A video file populated on the screen. I pressed play, and my breath caught in my throat. My father appeared, looking frail but incredibly sharp, sitting in his private study. The timestamp indicated it was recorded less than 6 months ago. He spoke directly into the camera, his voice raspy but resolute. He detailed his growing suspicions that Evelyn and Grant were intentionally inflating production numbers and artificially pumping the company valuation to orchestrate a massive, highly lucrative corporate buyout. He knew he was losing control of the physical operations, and his health was failing too fast to stop them directly. So, he built a legal guillotine. The twist of his plan was brilliant. He never intended to leave me the land, the warehouses, or the factories. Those were heavy, vulnerable targets. Instead, he engineered a fail-safe mechanism. The escrow agreement dictated that if any board member or executive was found guilty of ethical violations, gross negligence, or compliance fraud, the total control and ownership of the flagship brand and the exclusive sweetener formulas would automatically and instantly transfer to a designated trustee. The camera focused tightly on his face as he named the sole trustee. It was me. I closed the laptop and picked up the sealed envelope. Breaking the red wax, I unfolded a single sheet of heavy stationery. The letter was a confession. He explained why he had allowed Evelyn to push me away, why he had maintained such a painful distance during his final years. He admitted he had been deliberately isolated from the daily operations, fed carefully curated lies, and monitored by her private security. But he had never stopped watching me from afar. He had followed every single case I broke at Northline Integrity Partners. He read about the supply chain frauds I exposed and the corrupt executives I brought down. He wrote that he kept his distance to keep me entirely disconnected from the toxic fallout he knew was coming. He needed me clean, sharp, and completely outside the blast radius, because he knew I was the only person with the precise forensic skills required to read the encrypted files, understand the data, and execute the kill shot. I laid the letter down next to the undeniable evidence of corporate sabotage. The entire picture snapped into crystal clear focus. Evelyn thought she had won the absolute jackpot. She believed she owned the empire, but I realized she only owned a hollow, worthless shell. She had the noisy factories, the expensive executive offices, and the bloated payroll. But the true billion-dollar value of any impending corporate sale rested entirely on the intellectual property, the pristine brand reputation, and those exclusive distribution contracts. That was the only thing the buyers actually wanted, and my father had just handed me the legal mechanism to rip it right out of her manicured hands. I carefully packed the documents, the drive, and the letter into my bag. I was no longer a discarded daughter standing in the mud. I was an executioner armed with a signed warrant. I pulled out my secure phone, opened a new encrypted message window, and typed out a single text to the unlisted number Dana Mercer had used to set up the bank vault access. I opened the box. If you started this, I will finish it. The meeting took place at a 24-hour diner nestled deep within the industrial shipping district along the river. It was a bleak, concrete block of a building surrounded by stacked cargo containers, rusting cranes, and idling semi-trucks. It was the absolute last place anyone from the corporate financial district would ever venture. I arrived 45 minutes early, choosing a corner booth with torn vinyl seating that offered a clear, unobstructed view of the greasy glass entrance doors. I nursed a mug of bitter black coffee and watched the street outside. Exactly on the agreed-upon minute, Dana pushed through the doors. She had completely shed the polished, high-powered executive persona she wore in the boardroom, dressed in a dark, unremarkable trench coat with her hair pulled back tightly. Her eyes scanned the sparse room of exhausted dock workers before locking onto my booth. She walked over quickly and slid into the seat across from me, keeping her hands flat on the table. I skipped the standard pleasantries. I looked her directly in the eyes. I told her that she was not followed, as I had been monitoring the perimeter for nearly an hour. She gave a short, tense nod, expressing a deep relief. She stated bluntly that if Evelyn even suspected we were breathing the same air, her career would be dead by morning, and her personal freedom would likely follow shortly after. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table. I told her she played the loyal lapdog perfectly in the lawyer's office earlier that day. I asked her why she was suddenly experiencing a change of heart. Dana let out a sharp, bitter laugh that held absolutely no humor. She looked at me with a fierce intensity. She corrected me immediately, stating that she was not a lapdog. She explained that she was a highly educated hostage, as the Chief Compliance and Quality Officer. Her signature was a legal requirement on every single batch of refined product leaving the parish facilities, but she possessed absolutely zero actual authority over the manufacturing process. Grant and Evelyn maintained ironclad control over the operations on the floor. When Dana flagged critical safety violations, identified equipment malfunctions, or reported severe temperature control failures, she was completely stonewalled. When she attempted to refuse signing off on contaminated batches, Grant threatened to terminate her immediately with cause. He promised to bury her in endless corporate litigation and systematically destroy her professional reputation across the entire industry. They did not view her as a leader. They treated her like a highly paid, easily intimidated rubber stamp to legitimize their shortcuts. She reached into the deep pocket of her coat and produced a thick, unbranded flash drive. She slid it cautiously across the sticky surface of the table. I covered the drive with my hand, feeling the cold plastic against my palm. I asked her exactly what I was about to look at. Dana leaned in closer, lowering her voice to a harsh, quiet whisper. She told me she pulled the data directly from the cold archive servers. Evelyn and Grant assumed she lacked the technical capability to access the backdoor administrative systems. They underestimated her severely. The drive contained the absolute truth. It held the raw, unaltered warehouse temperature logs, proving the storage units had completely failed during the brutal summer heat waves. It contained the exact scheduling manifests detailing precisely when Grant ordered the floor managers to swap the ruined premium cane for cheap, substandard filler materials. Most importantly, it contained high-resolution scans of Grant's physical, wet signatures directly authorizing the illegal relabeling of those dangerously tainted raw materials. The pieces of the corporate puzzle were snapping together with terrifying speed, but one massive structural question remained unanswered. I looked at Dana and asked the most important question. I needed to know why they were doing this. Why would they systematically destroy the product quality and risk a massive federal investigation when the company was supposedly highly profitable? Dana closed her eyes for a brief second, shaking her head in disgust. She opened them and delivered the twist that made everything make sense. Grant was bleeding cash at an unprecedented rate. For the past 14 months, he had been aggressively and recklessly day trading sugar futures on the commodities market. His speculative bets had gone completely wrong, and he was losing catastrophically. He was completely underwater and facing massive margin calls from his brokers. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. To cover his massive personal trading losses and prevent his brokers from liquidating his accounts, Grant had been illegally siphoning millions of dollars directly from the company operating funds. To hide the missing cash from the internal corporate auditors and the banking representatives, he had been artificially inflating the valuation of the physical inventory. They were officially claiming to hold thousands of tons of premium-grade product that simply did not exist anywhere in their warehouses. Evelyn was not just greedy. She was incredibly desperate. She needed to sell the entire enterprise immediately before the fragile, fraudulent house of cards collapsed entirely and exposed her son to federal prison. Dana confirmed my exact suspicion. Evelyn had finalized a massive buyout agreement with Cindercrest Consumer Holdings. It was a highly lucrative acquisition. Evelyn was planning to sign the final, binding contracts publicly at her upcoming, highly publicized charity gala. the sweet legacy night. She wanted the press cameras flashing while she handed over a hollow, rotting shell of a company for nearly $1 billion, forever cementing her false image as a brilliant corporate savior and walking away clean. I felt the familiar, ice-cold focus of an active corporate investigation settling over my mind, the emotional weight of my father's death, the lingering anger from the mud-soaked humiliation. It all vanished instantly. It was replaced by pure tactical execution. I slid the flash drive securely into the inner pocket of my jacket. I laid out the strategy. We needed to divide the battlefield immediately. I would handle the external assault. I possessed the intellectual property escrow mechanism and the specific lending covenants from my father's safe deposit box. I would assemble the legal kill switch. I needed Dana to return to the office and maintain her cover perfectly. She needed to be the most compliant, terrified, and obedient executive Evelyn and Grant had ever seen. I needed one final, critical action from her, to automatically trigger the transfer of the intellectual property rights. I needed a catastrophic, undeniable violation documented right before the exact point of sale. I instructed Dana to bait Grant into signing one final, grossly fraudulent quality certification just hours before the charity gala began. She needed to make him believe it was an absolute administrative necessity to prevent the buyers at Cindercrest from walking away at the last minute. Dana's eyes hardened with a fierce, highly intelligent resolve. She agreed instantly. She knew Grant was panicking about a final inventory audit. She promised to draft an emergency variance report filled with blatant lies about the product purity. She assured me he would sign it blindly in his desperation just to get the paperwork off his desk and secure the sale. We did not shake hands. We did not share a warm, emotional moment of female solidarity. We did not promise each other a violent, cinematic revenge against the people who had wronged us. This was not about personal anger anymore. It was about executing a surgical, fatal strike. We were two highly trained professionals constructing an inescapable legal paradox. I stood up from the torn vinyl booth and looked down at her. I stated flatly that we were not doing this for vengeance. We were simply going to let the absolute truth follow the strict letter of the law. Evelyn had built this elaborate, fraudulent trap to secure an empire she did not earn. We were just going to let her walk right into the center of it, and then we were going to permanently lock the door behind her. I flew back to the Houston Dispatch Center of Northline Integrity Partners and commandeered our primary crisis room. I locked the heavy acoustic doors and powered up the 6 massive digital monitors lining the far wall. Over the next 48 hours, I fed every piece of data Dana provided into our proprietary forensic algorithms. I projected the global inventory manifests on screen 1, shipping logs went on screen 2, the raw material invoices, the commodities futures contracts, and the heavily redacted quality assurance reports filled the remaining displays. I was no longer a grieving daughter. I was a senior investigator dissecting a massive corporate corpse. The fraud was not a simple embezzlement scheme. It was a highly sophisticated 3-layer financial mechanism designed to bleed the company dry while painting a masterpiece of false profitability. First, Grant and Evelyn were artificially inflating the refined sugar inventory. The official ledgers claimed we held tens of thousands of metric tons of premium product ready for global export. But when I cross-referenced the specific alphanumeric batch codes against the physical shipping documents, the lie unraveled. They were round-tripping the paperwork. A single pallet of sugar would be scanned into the first warehouse, virtually transferred to the second warehouse on paper, and then scanned back into the first warehouse under a completely new lot number. The physical product never actually moved, but the financial valuation doubled with every fake digital transit. The second layer was the cash extraction. Grant needed massive amounts of liquid capital to cover the catastrophic losses in his personal commodities trading accounts. I traced a complex web of wire transfers moving millions of dollars out of the primary corporate operating funds. The money was being routed through a shadow logistics vendor, essentially a fake trucking company that only existed on paper before landing directly in the margin accounts of his high-risk brokerage firm. The third layer was the most dangerous and the one that would trigger the legal kill switch. To maintain the illusion of high production yields, Despite having no money to buy premium raw cane, they were systematically relabeling rejected substandard agricultural materials. They were taking heavily contaminated crops, the kind meant for cheap industrial ethanol production, slapping our elite flagship brand labels on the packaging and shipping it directly to high-end consumer distributors. I needed physical proof to anchor the digital trail. At 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, I met Dana at a partially sealed auxiliary storage facility situated on the absolute edge of the parish line. She used her executive security clearance to bypass the exterior gates and manually override the rolling steel doors. We moved silently through the cavernous, echoing space using only small, focused flashlights. We found the exact pallets listed on my data sheets. I took dozens of high-resolution photographs documenting the blatant discrepancies. The heavy industrial storage containers were clearly stamped with warning codes indicating agricultural rejection, but someone had slapped fresh counterfeit premium compliance barcodes right over the warnings. While we documented the physical fraud, a shadow detached itself from the back of the warehouse. It was the night shift plant foreman, a solidly built man in his late 50s who had worked under my father for 3 decades. He was terrified, his hands visibly shaking, but he had reached his breaking point. He recognized me instantly. He reached into his heavy canvas work jacket and handed me a thick stack of printed internal correspondence. They were direct emails from Grant. The language was not vague. Grant explicitly ordered the foreman to bypass the safety quarantine protocols, load the contaminated batches onto the outgoing freight trucks, and manually override the compliance logs the following morning. The foreman told me Grant threatened to terminate his pension if he refused. The foreman gave me the final nail in the coffin. He provided a secure digital copy of the internal security camera footage from the executive suite, along with a physical document bearing a fresh ink signature. The footage showed Grant standing in the accounting department, visibly sweating and screaming at a junior clerk. The document was a direct authorization signed in wet blue ink by Grant himself, approving a wire transfer for $7 million to the fake logistics vendor. I cross-checked the date on the document. He signed the fraudulent transfer on the exact same afternoon Evelyn held a massive press conference announcing a 15% company-wide budget cut to improve operational efficiency. The walls were closing in on them, and Evelyn was beginning to smell the smoke. Through my corporate monitoring software, I saw the internal panic unfold. Sensing a catastrophic data leak, Evelyn initiated a brutal purge. In a single afternoon, she abruptly terminated over a dozen senior managers and loyal executives who had originally been hired by my father. She was desperately trying to sever any remaining ties to the old guard, creating an atmosphere of absolute terror and chaos within the corporate headquarters. Let her panic, I thought. I sat down at the central conference table and began packaging the absolute destruction of the Rogers Cane and Confection Group. I assembled 3 separate heavily encrypted dossiers. The first set of files contained the undeniable proof of the quality control fraud, formatted perfectly for the escrow attorneys to instantly trigger the intellectual property transfer. The second dossier compiled the wire transfers and fake invoices destined directly for the Federal Financial Crimes Division. The third package detailed the illegal market manipulation tailored specifically for the National Commodities and Trading Regulatory Commission. I had the loaded weapon resting right in my hands. I could have sent the emails right then, burning their empire to the ground on a random Wednesday morning. But I pulled my hands away from the keyboard. A quiet, sterile execution was not what this situation demanded. Evelyn wanted a coronation. She had staked her entire social reputation, her financial future, and her fraudulent corporate legacy on the upcoming charity gala. She invited the buyers, the bankers, and the press to watch her sign the final sale agreement under the bright lights. I decided to grant her exactly what she wanted. I would let her step up to the podium, put the pen to the paper, and then I would drop the entire federal hammer on her right in front of an audience. The countdown began exactly 72 hours before the ink was scheduled to dry. Evelyn had transformed the grand ballroom of the most expensive luxury hotel in the French Quarter into a monument to her own ego. She branded it the Sweet Legacy Night. It was ostensibly a high-profile charity gala, but in reality it was a lavish coronation ceremony. She hired a 50-piece symphony orchestra, secured exclusive catering from a Michelin-starred chef, and paid premium rates to guarantee the attendance of every major financial reporter in the state. She wanted the entire Southern corporate elite watching when she signed the Rogers, Cane and Confection Group over to Cindercrest Consumer Holdings. While Evelyn obsessed over floral arrangements and seating charts, the walls were rapidly closing in on her son. My monitoring software showed the exact moment Grant received the catastrophic margin call from his offshore brokerage. The commodities market had experienced a sudden aggressive spike in raw sugar prices, completely obliterating his short positions. His account was deeply in the red, and the brokers were demanding an immediate cash injection of $12 million by the end of the business day. If he failed to wire the funds, the brokers would automatically liquidate his positions and trigger a massive federal trading alert that would trace straight back to the corporate accounts. Grant was drowning, and Dana threw him an anvil disguised as a life preserver. She walked into his corner office playing the role of a hyper-diligent but slightly frantic compliance officer. She told him the acquisition team from Cindercrest was demanding one final emergency audit of the primary warehouse inventory before they would authorize the transfer of the purchase funds. She presented him with a stack of freshly printed documents. It was a temporary compliance cover story, she claimed. The paperwork consisted of an emergency quality certification and a sworn inventory confirmation explicitly stating that all stored products met premium export standards. She warned him that if he did not sign the documents immediately, the buyers would delay the gala and potentially pull out of the deal entirely. Blind panic completely overrode whatever minimal business sense Grant possessed. He did not read the fine print. He did not ask to verify the warehouse logs. He simply snatched a gold pen from his desk and violently scribbled his signature across the bottom of every single page. In his desperate rush to keep the acquisition alive and secure the cash he needed to cover his illegal trades, he handed us the ultimate weapon. He had just personally and legally certified a multi-million-dollar fraud less than 48 hours before the final sale. The following morning, a courier arrived at my Houston apartment. He handed me a thick, heavy envelope made of expensive cream-colored cardstock. Inside was an invitation to the Sweet Legacy Night Gala. Clipped to the embossed card was a handwritten note from Evelyn. The ink was a dark, elegant blue, but the words were pure venom. She told me she had reserved a seat for me in the back row so I could finally witness how a true visionary manages a family legacy. She wanted me there to watch her win. She wanted to twist the knife one last time and watch me break. I did not feel a single ounce of anger. I sat down at my kitchen island and calmly filled out the response card, checking the box to confirm my attendance. I then opened my closet and selected a tailored dark charcoal suit. It was not a dress meant for a celebration. It was armor designed for a courtroom. I spent the next 10 hours refining my digital presentation. It was a brutally efficient slide deck containing the warehouse photographs, the forged signatures, the fake logistics invoices, and the offshore wire transfers. It was a chronological roadmap of their entire criminal enterprise. Dana was executing her part of the plan flawlessly inside the hotel. Under the strict guise of verifying the venue safety protocols and checking the corporate compliance standards for the evening presentations, she demanded total access to the hotel audio and visual control room. She quietly bypassed the primary security firewalls and established a secure remote connection directly into the main projection system. We now had absolute control over the massive digital screens flanking the main stage. The final piece of the trap clicked into place when my secure phone rang. It was the senior escrow attorney managing my father's intellectual property trust. He had spent the entire day reviewing the initial evidence packages I had sent him. His voice was incredibly serious, but completely clear. He confirmed the legal mechanism. If I could publicly demonstrate undeniable proof of a material fraud or an intentional compliance violation at the exact moment the sale was being finalized, the trigger clause would activate instantly. The ownership of the flagship brand, the exclusive sweetener formulas, and the premium distribution contracts would revert to my sole control right there in the ballroom. The evening of the gala finally arrived. 2 distinct scenes played out simultaneously, aisles apart. In the sprawling penthouse suite of the hotel, Evelyn stood before a massive gilded mirror. She was draped in a breathtaking custom designer gown, diamonds glittering at her throat. She adjusted her posture, practicing her triumphant smile, admiring the reflection of a woman who believed she had conquered the world. In my modest hotel room across town, I stood in front of a simple vanity mirror. I buttoned the jacket of my charcoal suit and checked the encrypted flash drive one last time before sliding it into my briefcase. I snapped the heavy brass locks shut with a sharp, definitive click. Evelyn was walking into a coronation completely blind to the fact that I had just finished building her scaffold. It was the biggest night of her life, but I was the only one who knew it was actually a trial, and I was bringing the verdict. The tires of my hired black town car glided to a smooth halt at the edge of the sprawling red carpet outside the Grand Hotel. Flashing strobe lights from dozens of press cameras illuminated the humid New Orleans night. I stepped out of the vehicle, the sharp, tailored lines of my dark charcoal power suit cutting a stark contrast against the sea of sparkling ball gowns and traditional tuxedos. I did not look like a grieving daughter, nor did I look like the erratic outcast Evelyn had paid good money to portray me as in the society pages. I walked with the measured, undeniable confidence of an apex predator stepping into a pen of completely unaware livestock. As I reached the massive, gilded entrance doors of the hotel ballroom, a wall of broad-shouldered private security contractors stepped seamlessly into my path. The head of the detail, a man with a thick earpiece and a heavy clipboard, held up a gloved hand to physically block my entrance. He did not lower his voice when he spoke, clearly instructed to make a public scene. He announced to me, and to the immediate crowd of lingering reporters, that my personal invitation had been formally revoked exactly 20 minutes prior by the host of the evening. It was a calculated, last-minute ambush designed by Evelyn. She wanted the cameras to capture the humiliated, disinherited stepdaughter being forcibly turned away at the door of her own family legacy. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not raise my voice to argue with a man simply following his payroll instructions. Before the murmurs of the crowd could even begin to swell, the heavy brass doors opened from the inside. Dana Mercer stepped out onto the red carpet. She wore a severe midnight blue dress and carried a tablet tightly against her chest, exuding the absolute authority of the corporate compliance office. She looked directly at the head of security and delivered an ice-cold directive. She ordered him to step aside immediately. She stated, loudly and clearly for the legal record, that I was a registered, legally binding stakeholder concerning the core corporate intellectual property and possessed active shareholder oversight rights that could not be revoked by a simple party hostess. The security contractor hesitated for a fraction of a second, looked at Dana's official corporate credentials, and then stepped back, opening the door wide. Evelyn had tried to lock me out with a velvet rope, but Dana just kicked the door off its hinges with a federal compliance statute. I walked past the guards and stepped into the grand ballroom. The space was a breathtaking, sickening display of stolen wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the hundreds of guests. I stood near the entrance and simply observed the ecosystem Evelyn had assembled. The room was packed with the exact people she needed to legitimize her grand theft. There were senior partners from the primary lending banks, high-level executives from the national distribution networks, and the entire acquisition team from Cindercrest Consumer Holdings, all sipping expensive champagne and waiting to sign over $1 billion check. It did not take long for the trap to spring. Across the crowded room, I saw Grant freeze, his face drained of color as he spotted me standing perfectly composed near the ice sculptures. Instead of avoiding me, his panic manifested as aggressive, misplaced bravado. He desperately needed to control the narrative. He grabbed 2 senior advisory board members by their arms and aggressively steered them through the crowd directly toward me. He stopped a few feet away, a manic, forced smile plastered across his sweating face. He gestured toward me with his crystal flute and began loudly mocking my presence. He told the board members it was so brave of me to show up, spinning the same tired, pathetic story about my supposed emotional instability and how I was just desperate to cling to the fringes of the family success after being rightfully cut out of the inheritance. The board members offered polite, uncomfortable chuckles. Clearly eager to escape the awkward family drama, I let Grant finish his little performance. I did not defend my sanity, and I did not engage in a screaming match. I simply stepped half a pace closer to him and lowered my voice to a register that only the four of us could hear. I looked him dead in the eyes and recited 3 specific pieces of information. First, I mentioned the exact model of the 6 luxury rental vehicles he had secretly leased under a dummy corporation. Second, I stated the precise dollar amount of the massive margin call his offshore broker had demanded at 2 o'clock that very afternoon. Finally, I whispered the alphanumeric code of a specific ghost inventory batch he had personally ordered relabeled just 36 hours ago. The effect was instantaneous and violently physical. Grant stopped breathing. The smug, arrogant sneer vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. Sweat immediately beaded across his forehead, ruining his expensive styling. In his blind panic, his brain short-circuited, and he desperately tried to defend himself against an accusation I had not even formally made yet. He stammered violently, his voice cracking loudly as he blurted out that the warehouse logs from Tuesday were totally cleared by compliance and that the wire transfers were completely legitimate operational expenses. It was a catastrophic, unforced error. I had never mentioned the day Tuesday, nor had I mentioned any specific wire transfers. By trying to cover his tracks, he had just verbally confirmed the existence of the financial crimes right in front of the board members. The older of the 2 advisors, a veteran corporate strategist with decades of experience surviving market volatility, instantly stopped smiling. The polite amusement drained from his eyes, replaced by the sharp, calculating gaze of a man who suddenly realizes he is standing on a live landmine. He looked at Grant's sweating, trembling face, then looked at my absolute, terrifying calm. He did not say a single word to either of us. He simply set his full glass of champagne down on a passing waiter's tray, muttered a terse excuse about needing to check on his wife, and turned sharply away. I watched him pull his phone from his tuxedo pocket and walk rapidly toward the quiet exit corridors, undoubtedly dialing his personal defense attorney to insulate himself from whatever explosion was about to occur. The first massive crack had just splintered through the foundation of Evelyn's perfect evening. The infection of doubt was now actively spreading through her own ranks. I did not need to say anything else to Grant. I gave him one final, empty look and turned my back on him. I smoothly navigated my way through the wealthy crowd, heading directly toward the technical staging area hidden behind the heavy velvet curtains at the front of the room. Behind me, I could hear Grant's erratic, panicked footsteps as he practically ran in the opposite direction, desperately tearing through the ballroom to find his mother before the entire ceiling caved in on them. The Sweet Legacy Night Gala reached its absolute, shimmering zenith just as the antique grandfather clock in the hotel lobby struck 9 in the evening. Evelyn took her triumphant place behind a grand, transparent, lucite podium situated dead center on the elevated main stage. She commanded the room with absolute authority. She spoke passionately about our deep family legacy, placing a perfectly manicured hand over her heart in a practiced gesture of false humility. She waxed poetic to the crowd of investors and society elites about her uncompromising dedication to elite quality standards and her grand vision for a highly sustainable, profitable future for the local agricultural sector. Standing exactly 2 feet to her right was the Chief Executive Officer of Cindercrest Consumer Holdings. He held a custom-engraved, solid gold fountain pen, hovering right above the signature line of a contract that would officially transfer ownership of the Rogers Cane and Confection Group for a staggering sum of nearly $1 billion. As the buyer uncapped the pen and leaned his weight over the thick stack of legal bindings, I stood perfectly still in the shadowed wings of the technical booth at the back of the ballroom. I looked at Dana, who was positioned at the primary audio and visual control console, her fingers resting lightly on the master override switch. I gave her a single, sharp, undeniable nod. Dana pressed the key, The sweeping romantic orchestral music that had been playing softly in the background cut out instantly with a harsh, violent electronic screech that made several guests spill their expensive champagne. The massive, high-definition screens flanking the stage, which had been projecting Evelyn's glowing philanthropic profile, instantly went completely black. A fraction of a second later, they illuminated with the blinding white glare of a raw corporate spreadsheet. It was the undeniable inventory reconciliation data. I had formatted the graphics to be brutally, unmistakably simple. On the left side of the towering screens, massive green bar graphs represented the millions of tons of premium refined sugar Evelyn had officially declared to the buyers, the federal regulators, and the lending banks. On the right side, a pathetic, microscopic red line represented the actual, verified physical inventory currently sitting in the parish warehouses. The discrepancy was not a minor accounting error or a simple rounding mistake. It was a massive, gaping crater of entirely missing, phantom assets. The heavy silence that fell over the grand ballroom was deafening. It was followed immediately by a chaotic, blinding explosion of camera flashes. The financial reporters and industry journalists seated in the front rows completely abandoned the staged, polite photo opportunity. They scrambled out of their designated seats, frantically tapping on their tablets and shouting questions toward the stage, instantly shifting their entire narrative from a corporate merger to a massive financial crime. Before the murmuring crowd could even fully process the reality of the missing inventory, Dana triggered the next slide in the sequence. The screens violently shifted to a highly complex, yet completely undeniable flowchart of absolute financial ruin. It displayed the direct chain of reckless, speculative margin trading linked explicitly to the primary corporate operating accounts. It showed the catastrophic market losses Grant had accumulated over the past 14 months, culminating in the massive, panicked margin calls from his offshore brokers. Beneath the plunging red charts were high-resolution, unavoidable scans of the direct wire transfer authorizations. They were fully executed, stamped, and signed by Grant himself, actively and illegally siphoning millions of dollars from the employee payroll funds and vendor payment accounts directly into his personal, failing brokerage portfolios. The final slide was the executioner's blow. The digital projection switched to the internal cold archive logs Dana had recovered from the hidden servers. It was the concrete proof of the raw material relabeling scheme. The screens clearly displayed the agricultural rejection codes, meant for toxic or spoiled crops, sitting right alongside the counterfeit premium compliance barcodes Grant had ordered the floor managers to illegally apply. Flanking the forged documents were the multiple, urgent internal warning emails Dana had sent over the previous 2 years. The emails explicitly detailed the severe health and safety risks to the consumer market, all of which had been aggressively ignored, dismissed, and buried by the executive suite. Sitting right at the dead center of the screen, magnified for the entire room to see, was the emergency variance report Grant had blindly signed just 48 hours ago, fully and permanently cementing his legal culpability in the fraud. The reaction on the stage was instantaneous and completely devastating. The chief executive officer of Cindercrest Consumer Holdings dropped the solid gold fountain pen directly onto the polished floor, as if the metal had suddenly turned to burning coal. He took 3 rapid, stumbling steps backward, putting immediate physical distance between himself and Evelyn, his lead corporate counsel. A man who looked like he had just witnessed a violent crime stormed up the side stairs. He grabbed his boss roughly by the arm and physically pulled him away from the signing table. The lawyer shouted over the rising, panicked din of the wealthy crowd, loudly and aggressively declaring the entire acquisition permanently void due to catastrophic material fraud risk. The entire Cindercrest executive delegation turned in unison and sprinted toward the VIP exit doors, leaving the billion-dollar acquisition contracts completely unsigned and worthless. Evelyn stood completely frozen at the lucite podium for 5 agonizing seconds as her ultimate triumph, her guaranteed victory, evaporated into thin air under the harsh glare of the projector lights. Then, the shock gave way to an ugly, desperate, an entirely unhinged rage. She lunged forward and grabbed the stage microphone, causing a sharp wave of audio feedback to echo painfully across the chaotic ballroom. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at the technical booth where I was standing in the shadows. She screamed into the microphone, her voice shrill, cracking, and stripped of all its fake Southern charm. She wildly accused me of fabricating the data, of illegally hacking the secure internal servers, and of deliberately trying to sabotage a philanthropic event out of petty, childish jealousy, because I had been written out of the will. She slammed both of her hands down violently on the podium, leaning heavily into the microphone. Desperately trying to project absolute dominance over the fleeing investors and the frantic reporters, she shouted that I could ruin her evening, but I could never, ever take her empire. She declared at the top of her lungs that she still possessed the majority voting shares. She still owned the massive manufacturing plants. She still controlled the sprawling cane fields. And she still held every single physical asset that actually mattered. She genuinely believed her own delusion. She thought that even if this specific deal died tonight, she could simply restructure the corporate debt, hire expensive public relations firms to weather the storm, and find a completely new buyer in a few months. She firmly believed she still held the high ground. I slowly walked out from the shadows of the technical booth and stepped right into the full, blinding glare of the stage lights. I did not need a microphone to make my voice carry over the panicked murmurs and shouting of the remaining crowd. The room naturally fell into a terrified hush as I looked directly up at the woman who had thrown me into the freezing mud and systematically stripped me of my family. My voice was perfectly calm, entirely devoid of anger, and chillingly precise. You are talking about the shell, but the thing that makes people pay a high price for that shell. You just lost it. I did not wait for the private security detail to recover from their shock. I walked straight up the center stairs of the main stage, my dark leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished wood. Dana flanked me, stepping out from the technical booth to stand firmly at my side. I unlatched my heavy briefcase and pulled out the thick legal binder I had retrieved from the French Quarter bank vault. I held the document high up for the flashing cameras and the stunned crowd of elites. I announced that this was an intellectual property escrow agreement, drafted and legally bound by my father exactly 3 years ago. I explained to the silent room that Howard Rogers knew his physical factories were being deliberately mismanaged, so he took drastic measures to separate his true legacy, the flagship brand name, the proprietary sweetener formulas, the exclusive organic certifications, and the premium global distribution contracts were all legally locked inside this trust. I opened the binder and read the activation clause aloud, projecting my voice clearly across the cavernous ballroom. The terms stated that if any executive officer committed material financial fraud, manipulated quality assurance reports, or engaged in reckless speculative trading that endangered the corporate entity, the complete control and ownership of the intellectual property would immediately and permanently transfer to a designated trustee. I paused, letting the heavy words sink into the minds of the banking representatives. I looked directly at Evelyn and told her that I was that sole trustee. Dana stepped forward and leaned into the podium microphone. Speaking in her official capacity as the active chief compliance officer, she formally confirmed to the crowd that the data projected on the massive screens was entirely authentic. She stated that the severe violations committed over the past 14 months were more than sufficient to trigger the legal transfer. Standing in the very front row, the senior estate lawyer representing the bank raised his hand. He spoke with absolute authority, loudly confirming to the room that the escrow transfer was legally binding, fully verified, and took effect at this exact minute. Evelyn gripped the edge of the transparent podium, her knuckles turning completely white. Her face was a rigid mask of pure disbelief and dawning horror. I looked her dead in the eyes and explained her new reality. I told her she was absolutely right about the physical assets. She still owned the massive processing plants, the heavy industrial machinery, and the thousands of acres of agricultural land, but without the elite brand name, without the patented chemical formulas, and without the premium retail contracts, Those sprawling factories were entirely worthless. They could not produce the high-end product that justified a billion-dollar valuation. I told her she did not own an empire anymore. She owned a hollow, deeply indebted manufacturing shell. Grant stumbled toward the front of the stage, his face pale and dripping with nervous sweat. He pointed a trembling finger at me, stammering violently that they would just declare corporate bankruptcy tomorrow morning and walk away with their personal wealth completely intact. I smiled coldly at him. I turned to Dana, who calmly pulled a second slim folder from her professional portfolio. I informed Grant that when he and his mother were desperately taking out emergency bridging loans to cover his massive trading losses, the banks demanded extreme security measures due to the high risk. I explained that Dana, acting under the direct instructions of those lending institutions, had drafted those recent loan agreements to include strict personal guarantees. Corporate bankruptcy would not shield their private offshore accounts, their luxury vehicles, or their sprawling residential estates. The banks were going to seize absolutely everything they owned. Right on cue, the heavy brass doors at the back of the ballroom swung wide open. A coordinated team of federal financial investigators and state regulatory agents marched purposefully into the room, their golden badges clearly visible over their dark suits. They held up thick stacks of official warrants. The lead agent announced loudly over the murmuring crowd that they were executing immediate evidence preservation orders and freezing all corporate and personal financial accounts associated with Evelyn and Grant. He cited credible, highly documented suspicions of severe commercial fraud, falsified corporate reporting, and illegal commodity market manipulation. Grant let out a choked, pathetic sob. His legs gave out completely, and he collapsed onto the carpeted stairs of the stage, burying his face in his shaking hands as he realized his secret trading accounts were locked and federal prison was his inevitable next stop. Evelyn, however, completely lost whatever remaining grip she had on her sanity. She lunged across the podium, wildly screaming vicious profanities at Dana and me. Her face contorted in an ugly, desperate snarl. She thrashed violently against the two federal agents who quickly stepped up to physically restrain her, completely exposing her arrogant, vile nature to the rolling television cameras and the disgusted society elites who had once worshipped her. I did not shout back at her. I did not engage in a petty screaming match with a woman who had already lost everything. I simply turned my back on her and faced the remaining crowd of investors and distribution partners. I spoke calmly and professionally into the microphone, announcing that I was immediately initiating a formal legal process to recall all compromised brand products from the shelves. I promised a sweeping independent audit of the entire supply chain and pledged to establish a comprehensive compensation fund to make our affected business partners completely whole. I was not there to enact a chaotic, emotional revenge. I was there to systematically restore order using the absolute, undeniable power of the law. 6 months passed since that chaotic night in New Orleans. The fallout was total and absolute. Evelyn and Grant were currently drowning under an endless avalanche of federal indictments, civil lawsuits, and complete asset forfeiture. Their pristine social reputations were permanently destroyed, their names forever synonymous with corporate greed and catastrophic failure. Meanwhile, Dana and I stood in the bright, sterile laboratory of our newly established headquarters in Texas. We were officially relaunching the core sweetener formula under a completely new, meticulously transparent, and entirely clean brand name. We were doing it the right way this time, building a foundation on truth rather than lies. I looked out the laboratory window at the bright morning sun. Evelyn and Grant had driven me out to that desolate, muddy road in the pouring rain. Truly believing they could throw me away like garbage, they cast me into the dirt as if it were a permanent grave. But they severely underestimated who I was. To me, that mud was not an ending. It was simply a field of raw materials waiting to be harvested for a brand new empire. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please leave a comment down below and tell me where in the world you are listening from, so we can connect and share our thoughts together. I invite you to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.